Thank you very much, Lindsay, and welcome everyone. Happy to see some familiar faces to me. I know we've got a great sampling here of faculty throughout the university, some instructors of W-2 courses, other instructors who don't teach W-2, but obviously have some writing components in their classes and are looking to learn a little bit more about providing feedback. So my name is Michael Clayton. I am a faculty member in COGOD in the Department of Marketing. I serve as the chair of the W-2 committee under the AU Core and have the pleasure of serving alongside Kelly Joyner on that committee. So for those of you that do not have a typical writing studies background and well-versed on the pedagogy there, we're certainly very fortunate to be able to learn from Kelly today. Kelly Joyner has been with AU, I believe, for 20 years now, serving as a Hearst professorial lecturer, teaches many of the Writing 101 and Writing, I believe, 106 intensive freshman seminar classes. And, you know, as a marketing faculty, I've had the opportunity to learn quite a bit from Kelly and other colleagues in his department through both the W-2 committee, the FLC that gets run on this topic of writing, which I would certainly encourage any of you who are interested in understanding more of the pedagogy in that area to sign up for that FLC if we begin those again in the coming fall semester. But as we were looking at topics for today's session, we recognized one of the challenges many instructors face is how much feedback is appropriate for students. Some of us get the red pen out and it can become just, you can't stop yourself from marking up every single comma and punctuation and typo and grammatical error. And it can be very time consuming. And ultimately, what does the student learn from that? What do they take away? So Kelly's going to direct today's session and really help us all understand some different approaches for providing the most valuable feedback to our students. Kelly, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome, everybody. So, as Mike said, we wanted to talk about the approaches to giving feedback on student writing, and maybe less on what you actually write on the page or on the screen, but more to encourage you to think about your approach and to challenge your approach and to have an approach. Maybe you've never thought about yourself as having an approach to student writing. So I will begin. So this is the Goldilocks approach, responding to student writing, enough and not too much. So as I said, we wanted to talk about having an approach, maybe begin with talking about goals. So these goals and this approach are mine. I think it's probably going to resonate with most of you, maybe not 100%, but it probably will resonate if you're looking at essays, but also looking at writing to learn exercises and information literacy work like annotated bibliographies and lit reviews. So for me, the goals for responding should be to foster transfer and self-efficacy. So you want to foster a sense of confidence and a sense that students can take what they're learning from you in your feedback, that you're not doing the work for them, but that you're pointing the way towards what they're doing that is good, and what they're doing that you can help them identify opportunities for improvement. So transfer and self-efficacy. Balancing suggestions for improvement with encouragement. Suggestions for improvement are important, not necessarily what I automatically think of when I first look at a piece of writing from a student. I often have to force myself to look at it both ways. So suggestions for improvement and encouragement. And then balancing responding like a reader with responding like a teacher. So what do I mean by that? Responding like a reader is things like, well, that's interesting, or I don't understand what you mean. So you're responding as not the authority or the arbiter of information, but just as another reader, as an interested member of their audience. So you should have a little bit of that, unless the assignment doesn't call for it. And then balance that with responding like a teacher. So good use of meta commentary here, probably echoing language that you've used in the class, which is important, or correcting things that are sort of non-negotiable. So responding like a reader and responding like a teacher are both important. And then preserve your energy and your sanity. So one of the important things we want to convey is that responding to student writing is probably the most important thing that we're doing. That one-on-one transaction, that relationship with the student, maybe the most important, or at least one of the most important things that we do. But it can take a lot of time, and it can suck our energy and our sanity. So that's another reason to think about your approach to responding to student writing. So think about how many students you have, what's the weight of this particular assignment, where does it fall in the semester, what comes after it. So the amount and the types of feedback that you give are sort of filtered through those questions. So when I'm have students submit an assignment to me, I like to start with the outcomes. Think about the outcomes. How does this particular assignment meet with the outcomes for the class? And that's going to dictate what kind of feedback I give. Also think about the class rubric. So maybe you have a class rubric or a unit rubric or a rubric for the assignment. But if you've got one, you should also sort of think about the rubric before you start responding to student writing too. And if I can just share a couple of things with you, see if I can elegantly do a new share. So this is the Writing Studies Program evaluation criteria. This is sort of our rubric. You'll see that it's divided into rows here, and they are more or less in order of importance. So assignment adherence, aim and purpose, and then you've got descriptions for A, B, C, D, and F. Materials and methods, form and structure, style, attribution, documentation, and the last, sentence level conventions and formatting. So the sentence level conventions and formatting, that's at the bottom of the list. That doesn't mean that it's not important to respond to those things, but less important than the big picture items and maybe the structural items. Sentence level errors in formatting, they are errors, they are rhetorical errors too. And the student needs to know that they've made rhetorical errors that are affecting the readability of their writing. But maybe that's not the most important thing to identify when you're responding to student writing. And then one more new share. So I created a sort of a game. I don't know if it's a fun game, but it's, I call it the rubric unscramble. So I've taken that rubric that we just looked at and I've removed all of the language and put it on Post-it notes to the side. So in the class, and this is just a way to get students to sort of attend to the language in the rubric, to read it. And then the object is to place all of these Post-its back where they're supposed to go. And the letters, I don't know if you can see them, but the letters in front of each one, they're just my way of making sure that they got them in the right places. But so each row has its own color. So it's, once they figure out one Post-it note, they can probably figure out the rest of them for that row. But anyway, it takes them 15, 20 minutes in pairs to put the rubric back together. All right, back to my slides. Okay, So next, now that we're looking at a piece of writing, the student-facing steps. So I'm going to encourage that you make the rubric available ahead of time to the students. Maybe in some cases that's not appropriate, but if they know that there's a particular rubric that you have in mind that you're going to be using to grade their writing, then why not make it available to them ahead of time? And then think about, before you put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, think about high order, middle order, and lower order concerns. How do you want to respond to high order concerns, middle order concerns, and lower order concerns? And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. But you don't necessarily want to start marking up the paper because you see a comma splice here, you've got unclear wording here, you've got this very long paragraph here. Probably makes sense for you to think about how much you want to attend to high, middle, and low. So when I say high, I mean ideas, thesis, the interaction with sources, how the student has incorporated information literacy learning into their writing. Middle would be organization, transitions, opening paragraph, closing paragraph, that sort of thing. And then lower order would be sentence level things, formatting, and mechanics. So in general, I would think high and middle order are what you want to attend to more than lower order. You want to give attention to lower order concerns enough so that the student knows that you're paying attention. And if, obviously, if they need special attention with particular formatting or mechanical items, and you want to help them out with that. Don't want to mark up the entire paper though. Again, self-efficacy. We're trying to get them to the point where they're confident in their own methods. So think about if this is a writing to learn exercise, if it's a sort of a short answer sort of exercise, and you just need them to think about the prompt that you've given them, and you want them to do a particular task that's sort of compact in size, then maybe all you need to do is give them a check mark. But one of my colleagues has good advice about these sort of assignments. If you just think about your feedback as fitting on one single Post-it note for a writing to learn exercise, maybe that's the way to go. That'll save you a lot of sanity and time. And just think about the scope of the assignment and whether or not the student needs a lot of feedback. Direct your feedback towards the thing that the prompt was trying to get at. And then for an information literacy sort of assignment, like a lit review or an annotated bibliography, again, you could just provide check marks. You've given pretty explicit instructions. You need them to collect a certain number of sources. You've told them what kinds of sources. You've instructed them what kinds of information you need about the sources. So maybe a check mark is all you need to do, but you could say things like, and how would this source be useful to your project if they didn't make that clear in their annotation? What makes this source credible if they didn't attend to issues of authority and credibility in the sources? Also, is there evidence that the student read past page 1 of this particular source? So if you've done your assignment correctly, you've given them the challenge to look beyond page 1 and to really get at what this source is contributing to the topic. And if they can digest that and then put it back on the page for your consumption, then it should be clear to them. It should be clear to you. And then if it's not clear to you, then you can ask them. And then for formal papers. So Mike and I talked about this because he went through one of the FLCs and this is one of his big takeaways. But so in writing studies, we encourage you to think about whether or not you even want to start giving feedback on the page or on the screen as soon as you start reading. Maybe you should read the entire paper before you respond. Read the entire paper or skim it before you start responding. Get the feel of the entire work before you begin responding, because you might find that on page 3 or 4, there's this huge glaring problem, or there's this dynamite idea that appears way late in the paper, which makes the sort of picky comments that you've made in the first few pages sort of moot. So consider reading the entire paper before responding. Consider also writing the end comments before you do margin comments. A lot of times the end comments will help you sort of proportionalize everything that you want to say. And then you can go back and add margin comments that match the spirit of your end comments. If it's an early draft, I would say you want to stick mostly with big picture stuff, the high order and maybe some middle order. Identify the main strengths and opportunities. Point to lessons covered in class. That's important. You don't want to reinvent teaching in your feedback to your students. You've done a lot of teaching in the classroom. So if you can point back to those things on the page, that'll save you a lot of time. And it also creates self-efficacy for the students. If it's a final paper, I try to do these 4 things. There's a certain amount of praise that has to happen. What's working well, questions and suggestions, correct the non-negotiable stuff, and then attend proportionally to mechanics and formatting. Again, you don't want to correct everything, but give them a sense that you're paying attention and that they haven't gotten everything right as far as mechanics and formatting. So that's the last slide before we have some questions for discussion, but maybe I'll pause here and see if anybody has any clarifying questions. I don't know if any hands are up, so.
Kelly, there's a question in the chat. Sorry, my printer's going off.
Okay.
Laura writes, can you make comments on something in the essay that is not included in the rubric?
Well, I would say yes. When it comes to putting a grade on it and evaluating it, I think you need to think hard about whether or not that should be part of your evaluation. But yeah, it should be fair game for commenting. There have been plenty of times where I've realized that I haven't made something explicit in the rubric or in the assignment. And then, you know, that's a note to self. Next time I write this assignment, when I revise this assignment, I'll clarify this. But yeah, I think it's fair game to comment on it, but maybe not to count off if they've done something that you think is not correct.
Another question in the chat. In Canvas, would you recommend color coding for higher order, middle order, lower order issues?
So that's an interesting question. Maybe Mike has thoughts about this. I tend to think that might be overwhelming to a student to have it color coded like that. I have had colleagues who have color coded their feedback, and they've managed to make it. I mean, they've taught the students to look for the different color coding and taught them beforehand how to accept that feedback and how to make use of it. So that sounds like a chance for you to do a little bit of preparation work in class, but springing it on them without that preparation might be a little bit overwhelming. Any other questions?
One more question in the chat. To your point about learning transfer, to what extent do your comments explicitly try to connect what you're telling a student to future work they might do?
That's a great question. I think I'm always thinking about how this is going to affect their next assignment. And if it's the last or one of the last assignments in a semester, I'm thinking about, how this is going to affect a future class. If so, in writing studies, we teach 100 and then we teach 101. So they have to take 100 first and then they take 101. I might not have the same student in both sections, but so in 100, I'm definitely thinking about how this is going to flow over into 101. And I want to make sure that they're more confident when they get to 101. Because the stakes are going to be higher. They're going to get a bit more freedom in 101. And I'm assuming that that's going to happen after they leave 101 and go to other classes too. So yeah, that's always on my mind.
Great, thank you, Kelly. And then one other question in the chat is, I use color coding and use the feedback also to review for my own purposes to figure out grading. Do you separate feedback from grading?
Separate feedback from grading. Meaning the way that it's presented to students?
I'm not sure, Piper, do you want to clarify your question?
Yes, please. So I guess when I'm reviewing papers, I am marking things as I go. For example, I might not always correct an error, a mechanical error, but I note them. And I then, after I've gone through the entire reading of the paper, including responding to things and writing and feedback, the next thing that I do is grade the paper. And when I'm grading the paper, I find that the annotations that I've made in the paper help me to determine what the grade should be. So what I'm asking is, do you do this in 2 rounds? Do you read the paper and decide what feedback you're going to provide, and then separately decide how you're going to grade the paper? Or does your process of writing feedback also contribute to how you go across the rubric and decide to grade the paper?
Yeah, I see. That's a great question. So I've got the general grading rubric in my head, knowing that I'm gonna have to put a grade on this thing. And parenthetically, we should also acknowledge that there's this new work being done about contract or labor-based grading, where the student does a certain amount of work. It's a lot of work. And if they do above a certain level, it's they get a B. If they do above another level, it's an A. So that's a different situation. But I always have the rubric in my head, the writing studies grading criteria, knowing that I'm going to be putting a grade on this paper when I'm done. And I figured out a long time ago that thinking about where this particular aspect of the essay falls on the rubric is going to keep me honest and is going to keep me from inflating the grade based upon how much I like the enthusiasm of the student, or tanking them if I feel like they've just sort of been lazy. But if I tie myself to the rubric and say the language under B for aims and methods, yeah, that's where this paper is. How do I convey that in my feedback to the student? So, and when I give feedback to the students, there's end comments above a copy of the rubric in table form, where I can just sort of, long story short, I take out all the information that doesn't apply to their paper. So what they have is, your B level in this row, and then I can write in the margin, this is why I think this particular grade is applicable for you in this row. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much.
And Kelly, sorry, one more question in the chat. Can you go over the difference between higher order and middle order issues again?
Okay, so by high, I mean big picture stuff, the ideas that are conveyed in the writing. If the student is supposed to have a unique take on the topic, then certainly that's high order. So their thesis, their interaction with the literature, how they've gone about conveying their understanding of and their response to the sources that they've read. So ideas, thesis, interaction with sources. And then middle is organization, how the ideas are linked together, if it's an essay, what does the introduction look like? What does the conclusion look like? Should there be sort of a tidy frame, the conclusion sort of satisfying the expectation set up in the introduction? That's middle order. And then lower order is sentence level, formatting, and mechanics. There's some negotiability in there. I mean, you might want to say that citing the sources, the actual mechanical part of citing sources should be high on the list too. So maybe that's part of their interaction with sources. It depends upon, I guess, the extent to which interaction with sources is important in the particular assignment. So I guess at this point, we want to ask some questions. One of them we can save for a breakout room, because we asked you to bring a sample of your feedback on student writing, not necessarily to share with us, but just to sort of refer to it. But one question Mike and I were wondering is, how can we track changes from writing to learn exercises to formal papers? So how does that work in your various units? By that we mean, if a student has a writing to learn exercise early in the process of an assignment, and then that leads to another one, and then that leads to a draft of an essay, and then that leads to the final essay. How do you track, or do you track their progress, so that it's not just looking at each part of a piece of writing, each iteration of it as a separate thing? And this is one of the hardest things to do. I mean, because you've got a certain number of students and you have to sort of figure out how to sort of document these things as you go along. But wanted to open that up and see if anybody has any thoughts about that, and I will stop sharing.
Yeah, I brought this question up to Kelly as I was grading my final papers this semester, and I would see something and I'd say, surely I would have commented on this in their rough draft. You know, I couldn't have let this go in their rough draft. And then I go back and I've got a page for each student. And sure enough, I made a comment to that student about this and provided it back to them via email. And again, they failed to take these comments into consideration. And so, you know, it's a bit time consuming. I got to open up this separate file, and then I'm looking more at my comments as opposed to comparing their original draft to this new one they've turned in. But would be interested in others' opinions. How do you see this development of their writing if they are using drafts or scaffolding? Brad?
Sure, I can jump in to offer one way I've tried this in the past, which was with a final project, having a kind of associated question that specifically tasked the students with speaking to what feedback had been provided to them earlier in the drafting process, and how did they choose to adopt or leave behind the feedback that they had been given. So it's a kind of way of going about this, but it adds to the labor for the student, but I think brings in the metacognition piece.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brad. Gorky?
Hi. Yeah, so this is something a little bit akin to what Brad was describing, but I teach Spanish writing. So at this point, for the majority of the people that I teach, I'm kind of concentrating on the mechanics level more so. In the there's one more advanced class where we do rhetoric and all that. And then sometimes what I've noticed in the last 2 iterations of that is like the mechanics get in the way of having people convey their message. So one of the things that we found useful is to actually have them do like a metacognitive sort of postmortem of something that they have prepared, but they do it via video. So not a video themselves, but basically kind of running their cursor and sort of making notations. And so talking about what they perceive the spaces for improvement are. And actually that seems to kind of stay with them. And it actually comes back when they do other things later in the class, or when they do their self didactic assessment. Also, they bring up some of the things that they have discussed before. So I find that goes a way to sort of cement some of the grammatical and writing concepts that we try to get across to them, to sort of having them actually apply them and understand why they're important. But it's an uphill battle, as you were saying. Sometimes it's like you give the feedback and it just doesn't seem to stick, or it's not actually handled by the student. And I think that's a problem. I mean, they go for the grade and then it just goes into a drawer or whatever it is that things get filed. So I've tried different approaches, and the approach that's worked is that one, because it's on them, and they have to sort of submit something that proves that they've done it. And then also kind of going away from what I grew up with, which was, seas of red ink, with feedback, to something that's a little bit more specific. So I go for the 80-20 kind of rule. I bring up to them, hey, concentrate on fixing these 3 things, and that's going to improve immensely what you're trying to do here. And that seems to also be more accessible to them and gives slightly better results.
Great. Thank you very much, Gorky. Rebecca.
Hi. I've used like a spectrum of things, ranging from something similar to what Brad mentioned. I find like those kind of formative feedback, kind of added onto one of their assignments, where they have to give the top 3 points of the things that they were changing. But I've also in one course that was for majors, and it was like a lot of juniors and seniors who were going into the field, created assignments where I gave them feedback as if I was giving them, it was a paper for a journal, and then had them walk through the process of actually going point by point and creating like a cover letter and and a document that explained how they addressed each of the feedback points in addition to the draft. So it was a very heavy kind of revise and resubmit process, but the student feedback on that was really positive. They've if one of our goals here is getting them to be more confident in their ability to communicate in the written form in our discipline, I think this way was very thorough and time consuming, but ultimately it made it easier to grade the final draft though. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Erica, would you mind sharing with us your revision memo and the instructions you provide to students on that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's really almost identical to what Rebecca was saying. I sort of model it after what you do for a revise and resubmit for a journal publication. So they have to respond to the comments that they received. And, just like in an R&R, you can choose to ignore comments, but you have to say why and things like that.
Yeah, I figured this past year with everything moving digital, people perhaps have tried some new things. I mean, obviously you can use track changes and features like that within Word, but then you probably have far too many changes and you just kind of see too much of the thought process that goes into the paper. So I don't know if that would be very useful. So again, I don't think there's a perfect way. It is balancing kind of the how much emphasis are you putting on that? And again, noting those changes in the evolution of their writing versus just addressing the draft itself. All right, Kelly, do you want to go back to your prompts?
Hey, Kelly, so sorry. I think you're muted.
Okay,
Perfect. Thank you.
thank you for telling me that. So we were going to put you into a breakout room so that you can talk about your approach to responding to students' writing. And then if you brought a sample with you, you could talk about how that sample exemplifies your approach to student writing. So that's what we'd like to do at this point.
Okay.
Okay. Michael joined the room too. Okay, I guess I will join the room.
I'm gonna move Aaron to room 5. Oh, shoot. Okay, I think that's fine. All right, cool. I just realized that I don't know that Kelly told me when they were gonna come back. So,
Well, hold
we
on, wait.
figured that out.
I haven't to room 4. Nobody's.
No one's, oh shoot, someone just went to room 4. I was keeping room 4 just like, I'm gonna move Kalani Clay somewhere else then. I'm gonna move them to room 1 so they're not alone. Okay, so the only person who has not joined is Catherine. I'm gonna go ahead and just put her in room 3 in case she does join.
I'm just lurking.
Oh, you're fine. You don't have to join. I was just like, in case you did, I didn't want you to be in a room alone, so totally fine. Okay, cool.
How's your day going so far? Have you been in all of these today?
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, let's see. 327. All right,
Is that everybody back now?
Yes, everybody should be back.
Okay. So Mike, maybe we just would want to get everybody to sort of give us a summary of what they learned from each other. I was in a room with Kara and Gorky, and we talked about more about the idea of having the students record themselves talking about the feedback that they got, and that way show that they understand the feedback and that they're making use of it. I think that's a great idea. It seems to me that that's a way that the student cannot fake understanding. I mean, they have to genuinely interact with the feedback. And then Kara was talking about being sort of wedded to the idea of having physical paper to interact with. And I'm very much down with that. For peer review and workshopping, distributing drafts is always easier online, but I'd much rather have paper to deal with, even students giving paper copies of their drafts to each other. But can we have other people talk about what they learned from each other?
Well, Kelly, one thing that came up in our room that I would like your input on, we talked about certainly when you have a paper that is really a challenge to read and very labor intensive to grade, it is very time consuming, but then the opposite happens where you get to a terrific paper and you're so relieved and it's such a pleasure to read that there can sometimes be this idea that, well, I've invested so much over here, I now get to save time because this student has it all together already. But can you give some examples of more of that praise and positive feedback that you think is still helpful for those excellent papers?
Yeah, so again, if I go back to the assignment and to the outcomes and to the rubric, I can say to that student, I can even pull language from the rubric. I can say you've really shown that you've understood this particular source's take on the topic. Not only that, you have performed the move that we see in the book that we use, They Say, I Say. You've performed a great They Say, I Say move here. You've clearly and coherently summarized what the source is saying, and then you've responded to it in a way that not just proves that you read it, but that proves that you've thought about it and that you've got something to say about it. You're forwarding the ideas and not just sort of parroting them back. You have connected your ideas in ways that I can point to. I mean, this paragraph links with this other paragraph. Those students who've hit it out of the park, I mean, they really want constructive criticism too, and that's not always easy to give them if they've really hit it out of the park. But I always try to say, have you also thought about connecting this other text that maybe they hadn't thought of? And this is not a reason to ding them, but sort of gives them a different way of thinking about where they could have taken it, or where they could take it if they're going to return to that topic in a future assignment.
Thank you, Kelly. Anyone else want to share discussions from their rooms?
One thing that came out in our room that I thought was interesting was towards the end, we kind of started talking a little bit about how in different schools, we have different class sizes for some of the W2s, and also different preparation levels of students, where some students in some schools may have a stronger writing background than in other schools just by default of the discipline. But and how that can mean different things for and weigh on instructors in different ways, and have have different demands on their time and effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I see in chat here, we also discussed the importance of students reflecting on feedback, and that seemed like a common element for our earlier discussion, many individuals having that component. And we did pilot a survey as part of the W2 committee this semester, and we haven't had a chance to analyze the results yet, but trying to get students to do a little bit of self-assessment on their writing skills to see, after completing W2 courses, do they have confidence in their own skills? And so that was a way of getting them to reflect. So that is perhaps something that you'll be seeing more of in the coming year. The goal of that is not to be evaluating the instructors. It really is just a chance to see how prepared students believe they are. And there is typically quite a disconnect between how students evaluate their writing skills and how faculty evaluate their writing skills. But that is one of the ways that we're looking to create that assessment piece. And then Brad Knight mentions peer review as a very another option to provide students to that feedback. And again, I've seen different structures for how peer review can get done. Some faculty I know, have a packed syllabus and are a little bit weary to allocate significant time for that peer review within their class. So looking for other opportunities to do that. We're fortunate within the Kogod School of Business. We do have our own Center for Business Communications, which does utilize peer consultants there that help provide students feedback. But that is something that in the last year or two, I have allocated a class period for peer review of their final project before they turn that in, really spending the time to go through my rubric and evaluate one of their peers and give them that feedback before the final submission.
I think peer review is also, it could be seen as part of your teaching too. I mean, if you are preparing them to give feedback to each other, you are sort of teaching them to be good audiences for the information. Are their classmates explaining the information? They're all sort of living with the same information. Are their classmates understanding and explaining the information clearly to them? And if you give them language for how to respond to each other and very specific tasks to perform in peer review, probably not a great idea to just sort of give them a bunch of papers and say, what do you think of these? I think it makes more sense to give them specific tasks in peer review, and maybe, within a group of students, different tasks for each student. Maybe one student could look at, this one particular element of info literacy, and another student in the group could look at formatting or it can be broken up that way.
All right, Kelly, anything last you want to leave the group with before we end our session today?
Well, I see Erica put something in the chat about an app. Eric, you want to say something about that?
Sure, yeah. If you click on the link, you'll see it's just an online application that you can paste in any piece of text there, and it'll give feedback about, okay, these are a bunch of nonsense filler words. These are, this sentence is so long that it's very hard to understand. These kinds of things, and then as they make changes, it sort of adjusts the feedback as it goes along. And in particular, I find this to be helpful with the students that I have who tend to associate writing for a class with writing very vague and complex sounding words. And so this gives them very specific feedback about being more direct, like Hemingway.
It's a well-named app.
Is that just something you recommend to your students, or do you require them to use that or to try it?
when I give feedback to students that have this particular problem, I ask them to use it in particular. But otherwise, I just kind of recommend it as I'm introducing assignments and things. Yeah, yeah, but it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have them, sort of use it during class or whatever to kind of see what, and I think it could be good for that as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Erica.
I'll just add that reminds me of a great chapter in a book by a guy named Williams, 10 Lessons in Style and Grace. But one of the chapters is about the ethics of style. And he argues that clarity, an academic writer is ethically bound to be clear and not make, to make their ideas as complicated as they need to be, but not more complicated than they need to be. And he argues that there's an awful lot of unnecessarily complicated academic writing out there. I think that's good. I appreciate all of the discussion, and hope everybody got something out of this, and happy to receive any other questions via email if you like.
Thank you, Michael and Kelly, for doing this session. We really appreciate it. Shada, our CTRL colleague, is going to drop the evaluation link in the chat. If you have a few minutes, we would really appreciate your feedback. And other than that, everybody have a great rest of your day. And thank you again to Kelly and Michael.
Thank you.